All right, guys. First, sorry for all the errors, right? The I don't even know what you want to call it. We were supposed to go live, but we had some things happen, some technical difficulties. But without further ado, welcome to Don't Limit God. I am Joseph, your host, and my guest today is Michael Brown, principal of Brown's Leadership Consulting, also family and marriage counselor. Correct?
Correct.
All right, and so today we're going to talk about being consumed. And to break that down first, is being consumed is about what we take in through our senses, and not only us consuming it, but it consuming us in return, and the effects of that, and what it looks like, what it feels like, and things like that. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me again, Joseph. Look forward to our conversation.
Cool. So get this out the way. Trying to see, I can't do it right now. Being a marriage and family counselor, I'm sure you've come across many problems of consumption, and the physical, mental, spiritual, like, and holistically,
Yeah.
right, and the effects of it. And so, how would you, or what would you classify as? How would you define consumption first and foremost? I guess.
Yeah. To consume something means, right, to ingest it, to take it in.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think the word consumption inherently is not negative. It can be positive or negative depending upon what it is that we consume.
Right.
Now, overconsumption is oftentimes where it becomes problematic when we take in too much of something. Uh, too much of even a good thing can create problems. You know, one donut is one thing, right? 12 eating 12 is another. So to consume means to take something in. Yeah,
And so, going to so yes, both good and bad. Even over consuming of the good still leads to.
that's right. And the key, oftentimes, right, is to find a healthy balance. To
Mm-hmm.
consume things that are going to feed us in a positive way, our mental, our physical, our spiritual health, career wise, family wise. Uh, I think it's important that we consume the right things, particularly when you think about, today's generation that we have at our fingertips access to so many things. Whatever you're looking for, you can get tremendous amounts of it. And it's important, right, that we are intentional and thoughtful
Mm.
about what we consume. Because if we're not, then it can consume us and take over and take us places we might not want to go.
So, about that. So today, right, and we live in today. So I understand when a lot of people compare today, or they say today when we talk about things. Um, but even going back, right, things that we consume today, or at least take out the specific of like a device. Let's sort of say, right. So obviously, we didn't necessarily have phones, 100 years ago,
Right,
or at least cell phones.
right.
But the consumption of, let's say, gossip,
Yeah,
right? So we're not necessarily talking on phones 100 years ago, cell phones 100 years ago,
yeah,
but the active is still there, right?
right.
And so the action of consuming is, or at least how we talk about it,
Yeah.
right? Uh, isn't new. Only I would say like the specifics of how we do it, it's new,
I,
or what we
that,
use to do it.
I think that's right. Some things, you know, don't change.
Right.
Obviously, technology and you know how and the methods of how we're consumed may change. But I would imagine, you know, for example, gossip. You can gossip in various formats. Now it's just may shift places, but in many ways, it's old. The idea of taking on too much, doing too much. Um, so different venues, different platforms, same issues. I
Yeah.
think it's important, regardless of the generation or the time we find ourselves in, that we're um, consuming the right things, taking in the right things, because there's so much access to what it is that we're looking for.
So how important is it, or yeah, so we'll go, how important is it first to understand one's personal level of consumption and where the balance is?
Great question. I think if we know we're being overly consumed with something, we lose a sense of efficiency. If we notice
Hmm.
ourselves not accomplishing the tasks that we set out to accomplish, right? If we're distracted, if we find ourselves being more easily irritable, if it's taken away, uh, if it's causing us to not reach our goals, then it's a high chance that we're doing too much of that thing, and that's where the balance comes in, and having adequate goals set. So if we know the goals we're striving for, and if anything interferes with us reaching those goals,
Hmm.
then there's a good chance we're overly consuming that thing that's blocking us. So I would say that's a litmus test. Am I
Yeah.
reaching my goals? Am I being as efficient and as productive as I need to be? Right? If you find yourself saying I got a task list for today, and you find yourself on the couch eating Fruit Loops, playing video games, chances are, right, you being overly consumed. I haven't reached those goals, and that's a measuring stick. Have I accomplished what I set out to do?
Yeah. So sitting on the couch eating Cheerios or Fruit Loops, right?
Fruit
Playing a
Loops,
game.
yeah, yeah.
Fruit Loops. First of all, listen, Frosted Mini Wheats, guys.
Yeah, I'm not a
Um,
big Fruit Loops guy myself, but yeah.
so that's one example of what it looks like to be overconsumed, right?
Yeah,
With something else aside from, I guess, your initial intentions.
yeah.
Right. So, what about the other effects of I would say the indirect effects of consumption, both good and bad? So, an example would be if you're if you're around a group of people, right? And in this community of people, they're all striving to accomplish their goals, right? They're striving, they're um, pouring into each other, right? Sort of say to make each other better. And while you may not necessarily be directly pouring into being in that environment, could consuming that environment, right, could influence you in a positive way. And then also, to the contrary, if the environment is inherently negative, right, and you may not necessarily participate in it, but it still can affect your acceptance of it and your being desensitized to what is actually happening.
Yeah. So is your question getting to kind of peer pressure around it
Well, not
or
necessarily
being
peer
influenced?
pressure,
Okay.
but yeah. So the influence of it,
Yeah.
while it may not like all consuming isn't direct,
There's levels to it.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
No.
then,
Yeah. Go ahead.
oh, I'm going to say it. And so then going into the effects of that, even though, because so for a lot of us, we feel, well, if I'm not doing it, even though I'm around it, I'm immune to it.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And well, I heard a quote that I really like a while back. Said, if you hang around a barbershop long enough, eventually you may get a haircut. Right. So our environment influences us.
Hmm.
To the extent that it influences us, speaks to our own discipline, our own amount of self-control. Some people can be in environments and be okay and not be overly consumed. But that's where to know yourself is important, to know your triggers, to know your tendencies, to know the people, places, and things and how it affects us. And ultimately, if we're hanging in an environment that's not going to help us reach our goal, no, you might not be overly consumed by it, but it still can be a distraction.
Yeah.
It can still lead us off course if we're not in the environment, in a winning environment, right? It's hard to win if you're not in. It's hard to win a game if you're not even in the arena. So if I'm hanging out at the barbershop and I'm supposed to be in the arena, I'm not gonna win. So that influence, who we connect with, the people we surround ourselves around. I call it people, places, and things. Who are the people we connect with, right? Because they're going to influence us. The
Mm-hmm.
places we frequent, right? Is that an environment conducive for winning? And the things I do, the things we do. And if we're focusing on those areas, that'll help drive us to reach our goals. And anything that comes in interference with that, anything that distracts us or that may want to take over and consume us, we have the opportunity to apply discipline around that. And sometimes just flat out say, no, you know, this is not an environment that's going to help me win.
Mm. So, what do you say about um, individuals that grow up in an environment, whether it's the community itself or
Yeah.
just the influence that's around, right? What television, music, whatever, right? And you grow up in that environment, and
Yeah.
so it's normal, and so you don't necessarily, while it is consuming you, you really don't know the difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Within that, right, that's where exposure matters.
Mm-hmm.
Getting out of that, getting some glimpses outside of that environment. That's where, you think about parents who will invest in taking their family out some. And it's not doesn't always have to be big, grandiose trips. It could be places right in the same city that they live in. It's interesting how you hear about certain people live in certain cities and never visit the museums or never visit certain areas or never went and did this or that. And a lot of times it's free, right? It's free to go to a museum or a national park, or if it's not free, a minimal cost, oftentimes, right? And we find money for a lot of things, and that's why
Yeah.
exposure is key. Exposure is key. So sometimes it's helping people uh, get outside of just that cocoon that they're in and getting them to see something different. Game changer. I remember being taken to um, some college visits. Some people at my local high school got us out. That changed the game for me, man. I was able to see, a HBCU marching band, and that did something. It's like, man, I want that, right? It exposed me, and uh, so that's key. While it might not be the greatest environment, let's face it, a lot of our neighborhoods, you know, there's some negative influences in there for sure. Not that there's some positive as well, and sometimes that does not get talked about enough, to be honest with you, right? There's some good
Facts.
things that come out of the hood too, uh, but to be intentional, you think particularly parents or leaders or mentors who'll say, you know what, let me show this person something different. Maybe it's not, maybe it's a different sport
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't fall into what most people do. So exposure is key. Um, I'm thinking about parents for some reason today, and maybe it's a parents out there that's listening and saying, you know what, maybe I don't live in the greatest neighborhood, but you can travel through books, you can
Yeah.
travel through tours, so exposure is key, and that may be that spark that child needs to say, oh, there is something more out here, there is something different out here. Yeah.
Yeah. That's funny. It's funny you say that. So my father's from South Carolina, and when I was what 7, I think I was 7 or 8. I traveled to South Carolina. And so that was the first time, maybe the second time that I've ever been out the state, but actually stayed there for a while.
Yeah.
And so when I came back, I was like, you know, this town that I live in, I don't really fit here,
Hmm.
right? Like I've never fit, right?
Yeah.
But I also saw the opportunity that there were other places where I could fit.
Yes.
And then so in that moment, I was like, yeah, no, this is not for me.
Get you. Get you.
I'm
And it
I'm
took
I'm
seeing something else. Isn't that interesting? You knew it sounded like you knew it on a subconscious level,
hmm
but it sounds like it took you seeing another environment to connect the dots.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what exposure does. Sometimes to, right. Sometimes to do different, you got to see something different.
Mm.
Right? It's like, I don't just have to just wake up and smoke weed or just hang out or or just whatever it is that may be pulling from somebody, and say, oh, there's something different out here. We got options now. And that
Yeah.
way, if somebody chooses a certain path, at least they won't be able to look back and say they hadn't seen anything different. Like, no, you chose that when you had exposure to other things.
hmm
Yeah.
Oh man. So even, and I guess that would lean into uh, intention, but also I would say you talk about emotional intelligence,
Yeah.
um, with a social awareness, relationship management, things like that. And for a lot of us, how do we, or the environment that we're in may not necessarily, what's the word, nurture
Mm-hmm.
uh, individuality.
Yeah.
It may not nurture self improvement or even self awareness, really.
Yeah.
And so, with those influencing parts, how do we? Because we've talked before. Like I was lucky. I always had the option of doing what I wanted to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I know most people don't. And so when you're in that position where you have or you feel the burden not just of your life but others around you, and you have to make change, but you also don't want to let them down. You don't want to go against the grain, so to speak.
Yeah. That's an important distinction you draw there. It's an important point you meant there. But on one hand, right, we need to pursue our purpose and our passion. That's unique and specific to us individually, right? Uh, where God says, I gave the child certain gifts, skills, and attributes. And it might not line up with what the parents had in their head.
hmm
That can be challenging. If the child says, I don't want to be a lawyer, and there's a family of lawyers, that your parents like, what do you mean you don't want to be a lawyer? This is what we do, right? And that can be challenging if a parent hears that, or if a family puts on that, or a community puts certain pressure on people. So that's a key distinction you raised there. That individually, right? We have a certain calling, a certain purpose, a certain passion that we're led towards, certain proclivities that pull on us. But on the other hand, right, there may be pressure to just fit in. And I say, you know, we have to answer to that calling, answer to that purpose and that passion, because the community is not going to be the one getting up working your job every day. Your parents aren't going to be the one who going to have to punch that clock for you. So
Right.
the individual has to, I think, do what they feel led to do. In particular, you think about a person of faith, right? It's one thing to have your parents or a community to tell you what they think you should do. It's a whole nother thing when God calls you to something. That calling, right, must be answered. And oftentimes God won't give peace or rest until it is.
Yeah.
And the parents and the friends might not be in that conversation.
hmm
And so I think there's a certain amount of individuality and freedom that needs to be expressed. Now, other people can weigh in, and oftentimes they'll see things in us that we don't see in ourselves, Right?
Right.
Sometimes that parent or that family member or that mentor will say, have you ever thought about doing this, because they see our skill set in it and they'll challenge us to pursue it. And we might not even have seen it, but they've seen it. So that influence can be positive, right? But I just think it needs to be in alignment with what it is that we're supposed to be doing.
Alignment. Listen,
Yeah.
alignment.
Key word, right?
um, keep listening. Yes.
Yeah.
Uh, even even being out of whack, right? It's still some
Yeah.
type of alignment.
Yeah. A misalignment.
Yeah. Um, so when we talk about consumer, so on a spiritual level, right?
Yeah.
If we're here, when we talk about being consumed,
Yeah.
um, faith is, and I really do think, and this is my personal opinion, obviously, faith is one of those things where it's very individual, but it's very much so community,
Mm, it's good.
and it's a sticky, sticky and blurred lines of what is consuming or what is
Yeah.
being consumed, right? Um, Holy Spirit consume us, right?
Yeah.
And then also what that looks like outwardly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have, I would say, at least today, I can't speak for any other time, but today, in my experience, I'm seeing a lot of independence in that tends to clash with more traditional mindsets or
Yeah.
traditional ways of life. But it's only traditional specifically in the area of faith.
Mm.
The lifestyle is modern or contemporary, but the faith is traditional.
Yeah. Faith, right, is can be a constant in our lives. People
Yeah.
of faith, right, that would be led by faith uh, for a believer. And for someone who may have more of a secular view, they may be led by their instinct, what they call their gut, right? Being led by uh, whatever it is that's leading them. I think that there's some key questions within that in how it ties into consumption and faith. Who's leading me?
Hmm.
What's leading me? Am I being led by social media? Am I being led by the expectations of others? Am I being led by my faith? That takes real leadership in an individual to say, I'm going to be led by my faith. Because that's one thing about, right, the word, reading the Word of God or whatever spiritual book people read, it clicks, it connects. And then we can say, okay, I'm drawn to this because there's leadership here. There's principles here. There's tools. There's values here that someone can build a life upon and be led by. And that's what our faith helps us do, right? It gives us a blueprint. It gives us a rubric to follow to help us reach the success that we seek. So then we have to ask the question, right? What type of success am I seeking? Am I seeking just good success, or am I seeking godly success? Because some things we may look at and say, well, that's good to do, but is it God's will for my life? Right? Does it have my name on it? That'd be good maybe if somebody else did it. It might not be good for me. And I think all of us, the only way we can increase in our faith walk is to, connect to the one who gives us our faith, and that's our creator. And as we do that, we're going to get instruction. We're going to get direction. And it's going to, right, lead us to the path that ultimately we're called to. And, this question of faith, you talk about consumption, right? So it's like, am I feeding my faith? Right?
Hmm.
Faith is not just going to come and just slap me upside the head walking down the street, right? We have to be intentional about investing in our faith life through our disciplines. And it's like faith or fear. Which one am I going to feed? And you think about what's going on in our world and our society, particularly, what just happened up in Buffalo, right? There's so much fear. There's
Yeah.
so much real fear that's out there that would cause us to say, why even put one foot in front of the other? There's so much problems and pain in the world. but to know that if you're a person of faith, that we can still navigate life and know we're going to be okay because, God's in control and we trust him over just what we see and what we experience. So we get the chance to say, am I going to still feed my faith or am I going to feed my fear? Whichever one we feed the most is going to win.
Well, so fear, right?
Yeah.
To me, and for me, I look at fear as uh, levels, right? There are levels to fear, and I believe fear will always be there. I don't. I put a distinction between fear and being afraid,
Hmm.
right? And so, for me, if you have fear, that's fine. Now, when it gets bigger
Yeah.
and it starts to consume you, like take
Yeah.
over.
Now you're
To me, now
afraid.
now you're afraid because
Yeah.
afraid says I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Fear says, I
Yeah.
have some reservations, but I can still move forward.
Yeah. One's more debilitating.
Yes.
Yeah. It's okay to say I'm fearful of something. Or even a person who says, I'm going to go afraid. I've heard that expression before, and I like that. Where, I am fearful, I'm afraid, but I'm going to go with my fear, or going with some fright, or whatever the emotion is, to say
Right.
I'm not going to allow this to take over because the mission is more important than this fear. Where I'm going, right, is too important for this to get hung up on this fear. And God can help us navigate that fear. He'll walk with us, even if we're afraid, and even if we're afraid. So many references in the Bible, right, about fear not, fear not. I'm with you. Know that I'm with you. That reminder of those who connect to their faith can navigate that fear and still reach the goal that God's called them to reach.
Mm-hmm.
But it comes back to, what do we feed? What am I
Yeah.
consuming? Am I fearing? Am I consuming language of fear? It's kind of like, we have to, I don't know about you, but you have to kind of sometimes be strategic about the news we consume.
Oh man,
Like if
listen.
somebody wakes up and just looks at bad news all day, chances are it can impact us in a tremendous way, right?
Yeah.
In a negative way. Now we need to be mindful. We need to be aware of what's out there. So we don't not bury our head in the sand, but you know, we need to also seek out some good news as well. Seek out things that are going to lift our spirit. Reading the right materials, watching the right videos. That's why, again, I shout you out for this podcast. Right? You're putting positivity out there for people to consume. Right? They can consume conversations like this, and it's going to
Yeah.
hopefully help them in their personal life and in their walk. Right? And there's good information out. There's good materials out. So keep doing what you're doing, man. Absolutely.
Oh
You're
man,
adding to
listen.
those positive outlets that people can turn to, particularly in times like this.
Yeah, well, man, I like the way you're segueing into where I want to go, man. Language. So language to me is a big thing, right?
Yeah.
And so don't limit God is a language
Yeah.
for me, right? It's also based in language, meaning I use God, right? The term that I use is God. The name that I use is God, but I also understand that I am one person with a relationship with God,
Mm-hmm.
and every relationship doesn't sound the same. Every relationship doesn't look the same,
That's right.
right? And so I always just want to say for everyone, right? Just because I say God doesn't mean you have to say God,
Right.
right? Your relationship is personal, and regardless of what I think or anyone else thinks, that's what matters. So we hear a lot of language, and I don't agree with all language, right? But I also understand that that's not my language. And so if it's not my language, then my opinion really doesn't matter. If it's not my relationship, my
It
opinion
matters
doesn't
to you.
matter.
At
Well,
least it matters to you, right?
right, it matters
Yeah.
to me, but
Yeah.
as it relates to someone else's relationship.
That's right. That's right.
So, we all have opinions
Yeah.
about others' relationship
Yeah.
and the specialness and the specifics of the relationship
That's right.
that we don't understand.
That's right. And that's so key that you say that, even that you think about the landscape that we're in today, where people can weigh in their opinion on so many different things. And some of that's good, some of that's not so good, right? Um, and it's important, I think, that we that's an important message you put out there, that we ought not be so judgmental of others, because that same judgment we put out to others can come back to us. And it's particularly when it comes to a faith walk with a higher power, or
Mm-hmm.
people who might not be who to ascribe to faith, right? They have the freedom as well to express or not express their faith. And if we're overly judgmental, then it's hard to have important conversations and dialogues that we need to be having. Who said we have to agree? You know, sometimes people don't agree with themselves. They think they want chicken tonight and actually wanted tacos, right? So we're gonna right. We're gonna not always agree, and that's okay. But we can still be respectful. We can still have
Mm,
a dialogue. We can still respect one another, even if we don't necessarily agree with their opinion or their perspective.
yeah. Uh, so I say two things, right? One is we all love generalizations until we're the one being generalized.
Mm.
And even just yesterday, just in my conversations with God,
Mm-hmm.
and God's like, we want peace, but we don't want harmony,
Mm.
right? So we want peace of mind,
Yeah.
but to go to what you're saying about acceptance and agreeing, right? We want acceptance, but we don't want to agree,
Mm.
or we want to agree, but we don't want acceptance.
Yeah, agreement and acceptance. It's an interesting duality you have there, because I think it's a fundamental basic need, right? That people want to belong. People
Hmm.
want to be accepted. Now, you may have some anomalies here or there, but I think, generally speaking, that's a basic human need. We all want a sense of love and support and acceptance. But that doesn't mean folk are always going to agree with us or agree with our lifestyle, or, agree with what we're doing. I think the key is when our rights and our beliefs leave space for other people to have theirs. And when we not infringe upon other people's basic rights, that's key. And I think, you think about, Western societies, oftentimes, there's a certain amount of freedoms that we have. But when our freedoms and our rights infringe upon the rights and freedoms of others, then we've crossed the line. And
Right.
I think,
Yeah.
but again, having these conversations, I think, help the landscape. If we can have honest conversations with people and not necessarily leave an agreement, but we may leave with some understanding.
Yeah.
I understand your viewpoint better. It might not be my belief system, but at least we can understand each other. And that
Hmm.
requires some skill, communication skills, right? Listening effectively, um, seeking understanding. I like the principle that says, seek first to understand, then to be understood. So often we want folk to understand us, but sometimes we have to go first in understanding them. And that takes skill. That takes tremendous amount of listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, what else? What do you have on your mind, man? Let's go.
Hey, man, I'm
We
just
should
enjoying the
run it.
conversation, man. Not too much. No, I think this is good. I think your line of questionings are thoughtful, and that's good.
So as we move forward,
Yeah.
right? And again, when we talk about consumption, we mean like the conversation has been communal, right? and it has been spiritual. But that also includes, our dietary habits.
Yeah.
It includes our entertainment habits, um, and all that, right? And so we had a previous discussion, and I told you, like, listen, I can't watch scary movies,
Hmm.
right? I can't really watch overly violent movies.
Yeah.
Uh, Yesterday, I was so I'm taking a class, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and so the professor gave us an option to watch movies around sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so I watched Friday yesterday, or
Hmm.
Tuesday. I'm sorry, I watched it Tuesday, and it's the first time I've seen Friday in like 20 years.
No.
First and foremost, it aged very well.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt.
Like
Classic.
it very well.
It's
But
very funny.
and then in the moment where Craig points the gun at Debo, right?
Yeah.
And I know he's not going to shoot, and I also know it's a movie, right? But in that very moment, I don't know why, right? But I became very emotional,
Hmm.
and I'm like, oh, what is going on? Like
Yeah.
my nose and everything. I'm like, am I about to cry? I don't understand what's going on, right? Um, but it's and that has never happened, right? But it's getting to the understanding of what's best for me to consume,
Hmm.
right? As it relates to things like that. Like I just don't watch scary movies. I'm not afraid, but it doesn't make me feel good,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I don't want that feeling. And so overly violent movies, overly sexual, like all these, I'm
Yeah.
like, nah, I'm okay with it.
Yeah. And Joseph, I think that speaks to. I would imagine this speaks to your lifestyle, right? If we're consuming things that are not in agreement with where our daily lives or how we live, it can take us aback. And everybody might not understand that. They may say, well, why can't you just watch that? Well, because maybe you're on a different path. As you were talking, I wrote down two questions I think that are key. And for the listeners, I pose this to you as I pose to myself. It's what are you eating? What's in your spiritual diet? What's in your mental, physical diet? Right? You've heard the expression, we are what we eat.
Facts.
We are what we eat and drink, right? So what are we eating? Because oftentimes that's what we're going to, the harvest, the fruit of that is going to be evident. Maybe you run into somebody you hadn't seen in 15, 20 years. And in some ways, you don't even need to ask them how they're doing. You can look and see, right?
Mm-hmm.
By the smile on their face, how they carry themselves, how they look, how they comport themselves. At least we get a snapshot, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah,
Aesthetically,
yeah.
visually, right? Once they start talking, we can learn more. And that's a result oftentimes of what they've been doing in the past 15 or 20 years, right? Whatever they've been doing whatever we've been doing, it's going to show up. And so that's what are you eating? Because that's going to matter. And the second one is what's eating you? We're talking about consuming things. What about the things that consume us? And if there's pride or unforgiveness or past pain or trauma that has not been dealt with or resolved, that's where therapy can help. And
Yeah.
and to deal with some of the things that may be eating away at us. And sometimes, let's face it, we need help with that. And that's whether, spiritually, through therapy, through meditation, whatever tools that people use for their own self care can help push back some of the things that may be eating away at us.
Yeah. You know, your two questions, right? What are
Yeah,
you eating and what's eating you?
yeah,
They're one and the same,
mm,
right? Ultimately, what we consume also comes out of us.
mm, yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah. Good stuff, man.
yeah, listen, thank you, man. I really appreciate you coming back. For those that don't know, which is like everyone, right? So we have another episode that we did. When will it come out? I don't know. We'll see. But it for sure will come out. It was great. It
I
was great.
appreciate you having me, and keep doing what you're doing. And yeah, I believe it's gonna impact a lot of people to come. Good stuff.
Now, listen, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your effort, man. I appreciate your intention, for sure.
Thank you. It's one thing to be invited. It's another thing to be invited back, and you invited me back, and I appreciate that. Absolutely.
Oh, listen, you're welcome. And when you know, right?
Yes, sir.
And I know. So,
Good stuff.
what this has been. Don't limit God. Uh, again, technical difficulties. Maybe we'll try it again in the near future. Good conversation, man. Listen, pour into others as they pour into you. Um, be yourself, inspire, empower. You know, most importantly, don't limit God.
Amen. Peace.